for another episode of Keeping It Behavioral, where we're empowering parents one episode at a time and breaking down behavior analytic topics to what they look like in the real world. My name is Ray Trank, and I'm joined by my co-host,
Adrian Beggs. Today we're going to be looking at applied behavioral analysis, or ABA, and its background is a scientific approach to understanding behavior and kind of talking about the different applications that you can use it for. It's most commonly known for being used with individuals with autism, especially children, but it can also be used with individuals with a wide range of disabilities and even into things like organizational behavioral management used by like businesses and companies. So we'll be looking at the backgrounds, kind of talking about the history, the key principles, and the practical applications, as well as some of like the historical controversy around the history of ABA.
Exactly. So we know that this topic is a little bit more on the dense side. So just to kind of start it off and say that, clear the air with that, because it is going to get kind of maybe a little boring, a little dry. So we're going to try to go through it just in a very top-down kind of way, keep it very broad when we're talking about it, because as we go into later episodes, we're going to get into a lot of these concepts in greater depth, especially with things like the key principles of ABA, but history and all of
Just
that.
Like a high-level overview.
Yeah, we'll do a little Spark Notes version. So going into it, we can start off with the history of ABA. So for those of you who don't know, everyone is a big fan of the father of ABA, B.F. Skinner. That's essentially where we trace our roots back to. He was a renowned psychologist who really helped develop the principles of behaviorism and the study of behavior.
Yeah, and he did a lot of experimentation with operant conditioning, which laid the groundwork for, modern day ABA, and really kind of focused in on how behavior is modified through reinforcement and punishment, which we'll kind of get into a little bit later what those two mean.
So what's great about our field is we're very, very new, and we're relatively new in the space. And so I think that really works to our favor because we're constantly shifting and changing the way that we're approaching therapy to make it as effective and person-centered as possible. And the emergence of ABA as a distinct field didn't occur until the 1960s and 1970s, primarily through the pioneering work of researchers such as Lovas, which if you look him up, there's so much literature surrounding the work that he's done within our field. And he applied behavior analytic principles to address things like developmental disorders, and then particularly honed in on autism. So kind of going out of the history of ABA, we kind of want to start dipping into the key principles of ABA, which Adrian will kind of kick us off with that.
Yeah, so one of the big ones is that so the ABCs of behavior analysis. So antecedent, what happens before the behavior itself, and then the consequence, or what happens after the behavior. And so within that, behavior is learned and influenced by its consequences. And I do kind of want to add into that consequence, I think, is a big misnomer that a lot of people interpret it as something negative or something bad. But in the behavior analytic space, it really is just what's immediately happening. So it can be something good, it can be something bad, it can be something neutral. It's just what's happening right after it, but that is what shapes behavior.
Right, and we use those ABCs to kind of give us a better idea of what the function is of that behavior. What's really important is we essentially break up every single behavior into 4 distinct functions. Attention, so they're trying to gain attention by engaging in that behavior. Escape, they're trying to escape or leave either a person, a demand, a thing. or tangible, which is access to something, a physical thing, and automatic reinforcement. Automatic is a kind of an all-encompassing function that includes things like sensory, and essentially automatic just means that they do not need another person to be delivering reinforcement. They get it from themselves and from behaviors they can engage in by themselves. Also kind of going into another broad topic is reinforcement and punishment. We've definitely talked about this on our podcast before, and we'll definitely get into the uses of punishment and all of that in a later episode. But from a overview standpoint, positive reinforcement is a big focus within our field, and it really dives into and focuses on increasing the likelihood that a behavior will occur again. So when you add this in, it makes a learner want to engage in that behavior again in the future because they've come into contact with something that is reinforcing to them, which is a very individual thing. And it can be many different things, which another episode we can cover that.
Yeah.
Versus punishment is anything that will decrease the likelihood that a learner will engage in that behavior again.
Yeah. Another big principle is just kind of like the individualized approach that ABA is kind of, known for. So it's really assessing each person, or if it's used in kind of the business behavior management, the company's unique needs and strengths, and then designing interventions around that.
Yes, exactly. Kind of going into our third topic is applications of applied behavior analysis. Our field, which Adrian talked about in the beginning, has so many applications that reach far outside of just one specific category. However, I will talk about one of the most common applications first, and that is autism intervention. Through the use of ABA techniques, things like discrete trial training, and applied verbal behavior, we widely use a variety of techniques in ABA to teach communication, social skills, daily living skills, and specifically apply these to learners that have a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, though comorbid diagnoses are very common. So we tend to also use these with learners that have a variety of other intellectual differences.
Yeah, I think kind of like going into like the education piece too, they're used in classrooms to improve learning outcomes and manage challenging behaviors, which really I think it's a big misunderstanding that it's only used for people with like developmental delays or disabilities, because in reality, I used to work in schools and I taught exclusively special ed, but like I was obviously around a lot of, like typical classrooms and all that, but it's used across the board by everyone. And most of the time they don't know that it is considered, applied behavior analysis. But it is, like any reward systems, fall typically under, the ABA principles. Different like instructional practices also fall under, ABA principles too. It's because we're managing behavior, and behavior includes things that you're learning, so it's used in all educational settings, not just special ed ones. And oftentimes by people who don't know that what they're doing is ABA.
It's everywhere. Behavior is everywhere, and we all do it all the time.
Yes.
Which kind of leads us into another application of ABA, which is organizational behavior management. And this is something Adrian has kind of touched on, in the last few points too. But we talked about its applications with education and autism. And so those, I would say, are some of our more common or well-known applications of ABA, versus organizational behavior management utilizes ABA principles in a business-specific setting and context, and really essentially helps enhance employees' performance, productivity, and increasing and promoting workplace safety. And if you think about it, this makes complete sense. And this is something too that ABA companies are using with their own employees. Essentially, if you're utilizing any sort of reinforcement procedures, punishment procedures, I guess even just like fading different types of reinforcement or increasing reinforcement, you're using the strategies. And just like we said before, behavior is behavior, and we all do it, and we all can benefit from different principles to shape our behaviors so that we can have the best outcomes possible.
Yeah. Another application oftentimes is mental health. So it can be used and adapted to support different mental health conditions like anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, and substance abuse, which also can kind of loop back into like autism interventions, because especially with adults or young adults, there's a lot of overlap between some, mental health conditions, substance abuse disorders that kind of go alongside it.
Definitely. And I guess going into our last category, this one is one of our hot topic issues, is the criticism and controversies surrounding ABA. ABA has come a long way, like we said, and relatively within the space of psychology and just behaviorism as a whole. We're still a baby in the field with the creation of this field. So definitely we're not always perfect, and have come a long way, thankfully, by lifting up voices of those with autism and intellectual differences, so that we can improve our practice and make it more ethical and person-centered.
Well, and I think too, before we go into those points, I think acknowledging some of kind of like the wrongs, that ABA has done in the past is really important, because just like history anywhere, like things are used in inappropriate ways, due to the time. But I think the big thing is that ABA as a field is kind of taking what's happened in the past and is making sure that we're changing the narrative of how it's being used, how it's being discussed, and being upfront and honest about, not trying to hide and say like, oh, like that didn't happen, because it did, right? We have access to history, we can see what happened and what didn't.
Right. And frankly, I think you're hitting on a good point too, where it'd be problematic if we weren't addressing the history of it. We're not trying to sweep anything under the rug. It's acknowledging the flaws is how we fix them.
And we're not going to go into every controversy or criticism today. To just hit the big ones, but there is,
more than what we're stating on here for sure. So ABA has initially faced some criticism regarding its emphasis on compliance and behavior modification. And some people have argued that it neglects individual autonomy and subjective experiences. And this is actually something that in our red flags episode that we released, we said is a red flag for providers, because as we have learned more about improving our field, doing better, being better, we have learned of the importance of not pushing compliance and instead, pushing for autonomy, communication skills, and really handling everything as an individual, unique experience, and keeping that therapeutic experience and learning experience as positive as possible.
Yeah. Also, right, there have been concerns about the use of aversive techniques and the lack of considerations to the broader context of behavior, which, I mean, the history with this, it is pretty dark. ABA was used as conversion therapy, and things like that definitely are not okay, and are, abusive. But, again, kind of going back to what we talked about, with red flags with providers and its use with autistic individuals, right? You want to make sure that your provider isn't using those frequent punishment procedures. They're not just trying to essentially make certain experiences so aversive that you or whoever's getting the therapy doesn't want to do it. It's actually trying to teach skills, not just make the skills they have really aversive.
Exactly. Which ties into one of the other things we wanted to talk about. some people have talked about how it's important now that we are really staying ethical with our practices, and really staying in tune with ongoing research and collaboration with a variety of different stakeholders who are impacted by care, and making sure that, excuse me, we're addressing these concerns and improving the effectiveness of our interventions. And this is something we really wanted to highlight throughout our podcast today too, when we're addressing these topics, is it's important to view therapy in an individualized way, to be open and to listen to those that you are providing therapy to, because we are providing a service and we want to be as ethical, considerate, and compassionate as possible. And that has been one of the biggest controversies, is that in the past, that wasn't something that we all were working toward, and didn't have the same sorts of ethical values that we in today's ABA do hold. So that's just something we wanted to cover. And so just like Adrienne said, these are not all encompassing every single criticism of ABA. There's so much more there, but we did just want to take a minute just to acknowledge some of the larger ones that have stuck out, specifically regarding like punishment and the lack of ethics that used to be present in our field.
Yeah, absolutely. So, just to kind of sum it up, so we talked about just the different foundational aspects, the history, the principles, the applications, and kind of some of the controversy and ongoing conversations that are happening. And ABA is an evolving field, as I feel like we've talked around in circles. But, while I feel like the applications and, the ethics of it are constantly evolving to the times that we are in, the core principles and the science of the behavior remain the same. It's just kind of how we're making sure to use it purposeful and impactful, while honoring individuality and assent and all that. So thank you for joining us for this episode. We are keeping it behavioral, guiding autism and fostering hope. We do have an Instagram if you'd like to follow us on there, and TikTok, as Ray is our, she's so trendy with the talks.
Oh, I don't know about that, but we're on there.
We are. And
YouTube.
YouTube.
Yes. Watch us talking.
Yes.
See our beautiful faces.
Of course. But yeah, thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye.